Testing. Testing. Kate's going to say a couple words.
You have to leave. You have to leave them on the stage. I'm so sorry about Amanda, but honestly.
I thought it was in the script, but you just never know. It's like,
I know.
You guys do this every night. Unfortunately, we don't have bugs in people's ears.
For dinner soon. We talked about it, but we're just going to pick a date when we can. You know.
You're not going to play the intro video? No? Oh, we didn't see it.
I don't know why I keep looking at this. I've got to put it away. The weather has been, this morning I drove to go down and look at this. It really is. Yeah. I mean, it is. It's a beautiful place. And you take part in that?
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our inaugural lecture today, named after the famed PBS. In case you don't, I'm Steve. I'm chairman and council. I'd like to give a special welcome to actually kicks off spring meeting. Before we get started with today's presentation, I wanted to share a little background how this lecture originated. It came conversation between Fred Scott and former chair Alice Handy, who's sitting over here, as they made their way home from Jim's moving memorial in January of 2020. Fred and Jim shared a special bond, having both, and it was Fred who first brought Jim to the Miller Center back in the summer of 2015. Charles. Fred and Alice set about lobbying the idea to endow a lecture series. Sure enough, with the support in a center, out Fred and Karen, my wife, to thank the George and Democracy Praxis for financial support of this event and other signature public events at the Miller Center. As you will see, his wife Kate sat for a 3-hour history interview with Barbara Perry and Jim went on to serve on our governing council from 2016 until his passing in 2020. I was lucky enough to join the board at the same time as Jim. I was feeling like a when I met candidates in the meeting Dr. Willie Mays in a different context. I used to watch his show with my father when I was in high school. Jim was a true player coach. sitting at a number of public events, providing wise counsel for scholars. As you know, etc., and Jim and Ann Compton, who's here, also were very helpful. And though Jim is perhaps best known for being one of America's leading journalists as a founder and anchor of PBS NewsHour, he was also an author, playwright, and screenwriter. But that's not his lifetime. Jim moderated no less than 12 presidential debates, presidency from JFK to Barack. Only this lectureship was endowed to honor Jim, not just for his many professional accomplishments and the integrity he exuded. David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, commentator, the Second Mountain Quest for Moral Integrity quite well. It reads, when Jim was entering the news, his face tended to be warm but so stoical because he did not think it should be the story. The news should be the story. But when the camera was not on him, his face was incredibly expressive. When I was talking on our segment and I said something cheap or crass, I would see his mouth turn down. You could see that at board meetings sometimes too, Bill, I fear. But when I said something that was useful, civil, or amusing, I would see his eyes crinkle with pleasure. Lehrer never had to formally tell me how to behave, but in this subtle and wordless way, he trained me to meet our standards of what is right. In this way, our way of being, a moral ecology, prioritized, and certain ways of being expected. It's been several years since Lehrer retired, but the culture he instilled still defines the NewsHour today. So that's right in the front of Brooks's book. Jim was committed to this moral ecology and devoted to allowing the facts of the news speak for themselves. And I know you will all see a similar commitment to journalistic integrity in Judy Woodruff this afternoon, who has in fact just won the Emmys live into this. But before we get started with the main event, we'd like to play a brief film honoring Jim's life. A big thanks to the Miller Center team led by Mike Greco for producing this. Much of it taken from Jim and Kate's 2015 oral history with us. After the film, we'll welcome Kate Lehrer to the podium to share a few words. We're honored she's here today together with her daughters and their families. Enjoy, and thanks again to all of you for being here.
Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the NewsHour tonight, the news of this Friday. So being on television, particularly on live television as I was for as long as I was, it was every evening, it was a kind of up experience. And Adrenaline. And,
Butterflies every night?
Every night, because the potential for making an ass of myself on national television confronted me every moment. Not only not to embarrass yourself, but also the pressure to get it right and to try to make sure that you've got all the bases covered, that you've treated somebody fairly.
It's funny to think now, but I guess did they publicize the
Yes.
route? Oh, sure.
Yeah, oh, it was
I wrote
very...
the story with the route, the one that Oswald had in his possession.
It came out the afternoon before, didn't it?
That's right. That's right. It was found in his effects. It was my story. It was on the front page of the Dallas Times-Herald.
And we'd only been in Washington a month, I think. We heard that in 3 days, PBS was going to get chopped. And then Watergate broke the morning you heard that, I think. After that,
was over.
PBS was just forgotten. So when we saw Watergate, it was like,
Saved by some thugs.
yes.
But the irony, of course, the great irony was we then later broadcast the Watergate hearings, and that saved PBS.
Yeah.
I got a call from George H.W. Bush right after he'd left the White House. And he said, Jim, I need a favor. Yes, sir. What is it? He said, well, we're going to have a little roundtable discussion in Colorado Springs about the Cold War. And I'd like for you to moderate it. And I said, oh, Mr. President, it's a deal. But I said, to my credit, I said, I'm going to take a dime for this. And then quick follow-up involves Kate and me. He called me again a few months later, or a year later, I don't know. He said, look, I want to do the same thing for Asia. And I said, well, sure, Mr. President, in for a nickel, in for a dollar, no deal, no big deal. Still no pay, though. And he said, fine. And so we agreed to do it, all set to go. And then I get a call from his office saying, could you come a day early for dinner with President and Mrs. Bush? And I reluctantly say yes, thinking it's going to be another dinner and all that. We go downstairs, and standing there waiting for us are George and Barbara Bush. And there's a couple of Secret Service agents, and they put us in a car. And the four of us, just the four of us, have dinner at an Italian restaurant. Secret Service cleaned out the restaurant so we could do it. And we talked for 2 hours. Everything was off the record. It was great fun. It was a magic experience, you know. And I realized what he had done. I wouldn't take money. So it was the best way?
That was your honorarium.
That was the honorarium. Which was worth all. And
Priceless.
Thoughtful man, though. Somebody owning a George H.W. Bush would think in those terms. There are very few nights that I left to go home to my adoring wife and not feeling good, at least about what we tried to do. Doesn't mean we always pulled it off. Sometimes we had the wrong people on the wrong story on the wrong night. But as a general rule, I always felt good about what we tried to do. And there were some times when I felt, till I was so happy.
We are heartbroken here at the NewsHour. Jim's legacy of journalism is with us.
Just a little a quick footnote to George H.W. Bush. When he was going, what the first panel was that he was asked to moderate was talk about the ending of the Cold War. It was about 5 years later. It was H. Bush. I've got the people, Gorbachev, Mitterrand, Mulroney, and Margaret Thatcher. That was the panel he was. Yes. And the night before at a cocktail party, the President Bush came over and apologizing the whole time and said, oh, you've got to, I'm sorry, Jim, but you've just got to come and talk to Mrs. Thatcher. She's got to talk to you, insisting on it. So he goes to talk to Mrs. Thatcher. Now, it took all of Jim's considerable charms to convince her that it was okay, that, you know, that he was going to moderate this panel the next morning, because she had many things she wanted to happen and how she wanted it to happen. And we didn't realize until the next day that, of course, his name is Jim Lehrer, and she hated Germans. she no Cold War over for her. Keep the, but at any rate, so everything went fine. She was on the program, and then at noon she left. Well, Jim was as happy as world leaders were. She's gone because they were all intimidated. I just want to say that this is an extraordinary event, an extraordinary what the Miller Center is doing. And Judy for coming. We ask all of you. One of our daughters couldn't make it today because she's got COVID. So we were sorry about that. Jim loved the Miller Center. This meant so much to him. He loved the people. He loved the programs. He loved everything about it. He loved coming to Charlottesville. And my family thanks all of you so much. This is very special and important to us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kate. I'll be momentarily. Don't conversation. Serves as anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour and other news at BBC, CNN, and PBS. It could be no fitting person to honor Jim's legacy than Judy, whose commitment to sharing the truth and uphold high standards of journalism across the country, indeed around the world. House correspondent and then chief Washington correspondent for NBC from 1997 to 1983. She's then joined PBS correspondent for the McNeil and anchored PBS's award-winning docuseries Front. Then joined CNN in 1993, the weekday program, and returned to the. In 2013, she and the late Gwen Ifill became the first two women to co-anchor a national news broadcast. Woodruff was our anchor. In the last 2 years since Jim's passing alone, she has led the team's coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic, economic turmoil, the January 6th election, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its ramifications. And she was also my buddy every weeknight. She is a graduate of Duke University, where is a trustee emerita. It is a sign of how highly we regard Judy that her Duke did not prevent us from asking her to join us. And a sign of her toleration for civility and respectful discourse that she agreed to join. We're truly honored to have you join us today. Today we were flipping the script. She is our interviewee. She's here to answer questions about her work, how she approaches reporting, and Jim's legacy of journalistic integrity. We are so grateful for her join us for this inaugural lecture. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Judy Woodruff. Director of the Miller Center, and he'll be conducting.
Well, Judy, thank you. It is such an honor to have you here. We'll dive right in, but before doing so, I just do want to thank Alice Handy and Peter Stout. Steve's predecessor, Alice, was our before Alice was Gene Fife, who was a graduate himself, or not a Duke graduate, I think 4 Duke graduates.
That's right.
Gene was did the lecture. Fred and Karen Turner, whose idea this was, and they're with us today. and we also supported her. So just a round of applause for them. And of course, to our whole team together, we're so delighted. We've had UVA's stock and but this is really very special, and we're so appreciative coming down for this. We've been planning for some time. Judy, I just want to jump right in. I saw you on.
May I just say what an incredible honor this is. I mean, for me to be here as part of Jim Lehrer's legacy, who meant I than anyone in my career, in my decision to place, being there over 10 years and then coming back, and I've been back years. It's just an honor beyond that I have the. I want to thank the Miller Center. I want to thank the university, Duke background, and especially to thank you and your amazing. Thank you.
You almost preempted. Tell us about Jim.
Wow. Where do I begin? I met Jim in the 1970s, early 80s, and we lived near one another. Paths would cross to what a he was, journalist was, but the moment when I had been at NBC, as you mentioned in the lead-in, and I was thinking about how to, where is journalism headed? And I knew that the NewsHour, that Jim and Robin were expanding what had been a half-hour program to an hour. And my at the time, I was in was gobsmacked. I was thinking, yes. Why is that? It's because that's just the ethos of television. But I had a conversation with Jim and talked to him about what it was. Jim has, in the picture and in the video, very dark eyes, and he has a way of just sort of drilling right, not only from and what he believes, and that came across to me from the very beginning. He was the best kind of journalist you can imagine. Funny, tough, demanding, a demanding boss, which is good for all of us in this business, and somebody who was a guiding light, and just being, and we miss him every day.
There are a lot of friends of Jim that served on the council with him, a lot of fans, obviously. There are a whole lot of students in his last. I'm to hear your thoughts about what was his style of journalism, and particularly, how does it carry over to Brooks' quote about the moral, just a few phrases, ideas of being that you still feel today?
Well, I love that term moral ecology that David used. I think it wasn't like Jim went, this is what you need to do, this informing to help understand what responsibility, figure out what are the most important things going on in the world that into an hour, excuse me, and that's not always the easiest thing because, as you know, so we've had tough, but in my inner ear, saying, okay, remember, want to you know, to guide me, because but if you're living in Dallas, Texas, or Omaha, Nebraska, or I don't know, someplace in Maine, Oregon, you're thinking about today, whether you are a truck driver or a lawyer, or a teacher, or a homemaker, what are you thinking? What's on your mind? And that's how we try to drive the decisions we make. It's thinking about real people out there and their lives. What are the questions they have? What is it that they're puzzled about? What are they maybe angry about today that we want to help try to clarify?
It's been an incredible 2 years since the crises that Steve mentioned, even a couple others, and pull out, and the tragedies that you all have, great journalists like Jane Furr on the ground there, going back and forth between there and Ukraine. I'd love to walk through some of these crises and have you tell us where you see the heart of each of these stories, with Robin McNeil, Justice Breyer, and the head of PBS, Rockefeller.
Yeah.
Robin McNeil said Jim had a gut instinct for Pearl Harbor. So on the orders out there, the science, cover economics, news media coverage, where did you see the heart of that story?
It's such a big question, because I've never ever in my life affected every single human being on the planet. We were all affected, whether we've had COVID or not. It affected the world that we live in, our public health, our economy, our everything. And no question. But you add the moral heart, it's how do we have a way to address this, which we didn't have, until we had a vaccine. All we could do is wear masks. People say, and it was also trying to understand, frankly, at some how so political, that despite all the evidence and all virus that was weren't to do what they needed to keep themselves and the people around them safe. To me, became a big part of the story. It's understanding, of course, understanding the science. How long is this going to be with us? And I don't think any of us knew in that first year that we were still, at this point in 2022, still going to be having cases popping up. I mean, just this week in my own, Kate mentioned of her daughters, in my own, in the NewsHour, 2 of my colleagues, we are still dealing with it all these months later. So I hope we've all my colleagues, who has done phenomenal NewsHour, through one last week, looking at this very question, information, with all of our information system, country with one of the highest per capita death rates. We are hitting 1 million people this week. Why is that? And trying to understand that. So we've all driven the science to the body of it, the politics of it, and it's still unfolding, frankly, before our
Divisions within the NewsHour.
Well, we have debates every day. It's healthy. Goes an hour, and it's good to talk about. What does one of us think, others think, and we're always asking, what are the angles we don't see here? What are you seeing? Because there are people on the call who are in different parts. On the Coast, for example, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? I want to make sure they have, as much as we can, 300 of my on you know, I was and I right, but what did we get? It did to do, and at least I will say, I mean, we do it, not others, but my own. Say, as I look back at work, I feel pretty good about what we've done. I'm not saying it's been perfect, but when I look at what William has done, what Lisa, Nick, I mean, I put the whole group together and I could be an ability they have together. I have to say, we will talk to people around the country, nurses, teachers. We have, in my view, I think we've tried to touch the heart.
Unfolding a deeply divided country, both politically but also geographically, different parts of the country feeling very differently in terms of reaching middle America. So tell us about into the presidential election period and the moral heart of that story.
And because, as you know, COVID happened, as you know, at the beginning of the final year of office. Reactions to it and how he handled it. That, of course, because of the campaign. It was really interesting, though, in the beginning of that year, you had what were supposed to be the pivotal caucus and primaries, the Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, that traditional political rollout. That was going to be a huge and focus. But as you called off, just and by the pandemic from everything to cover a campaign without going out and talking to voters. Real experience, and yet the president was on television in the base of his home and making as many statements as he could, but
and you were in front of your home bookshelf,
and
as we all learned.
And I was anchoring from home, where I never expected to be, and I spent a year anchoring from, you know, and so I honestly did day at a time. What do we need to do today? Do we have access to a candidate? And up until the time when I guess Bernie Sanders stayed in until quite far into the primary season, and then at some point he got out. It was clear Biden had it wrapped up, but it was still very strange because we weren't able to see people. We were interviewing everybody remotely. I hope we never have to go through another campaign like this. But I also think, I will say this, I think it forced us to think really hard about the values and about the, you know, you keep coming back to this very good question about what's the moral center. What really matters in this campaign? What really matters is how were these leaders dealing with this pandemic? How were they dealing with the economic disruption, with people, with jobs disappearing overnight, everybody staying home? And then as we came to find out what would be what we now the term the supply chain and so forth. So all of those things became known to us, but it was, I can't say that we had a crystal ball that told us 2020, here's where you're going to be. There's no way. We didn't know who was going to win the election. We saw the polls, the same as everybody else. We had no way that Donald Trump was going to be the result of the election. We had no way of anticipating where the six. So much of it, we had to cover it day in and day out, and try to do it as honestly as we could.
It's often easy to bet that the racial justice for the killing of George Floyd happened in the early months of the pandemic. And suddenly people are actually out in the streets and people are outside. Talk about that, because you are all inside, but then there's actually something physically in the streets that's hard to cover from home. There's all up in the issue around George Floyd, but then there's also the reality of putting people out there.
Well, as if we already have a lot of important stuff going on in the country, which we did with the pandemic, with the election, the political polarization in the country, the economy, again, I've talked, you have the murder, and just the fact of it, the visual of it, which of course we are all now, we were very familiar with what happened that day, the horror of it, trying to understand how could it happen, how could this, I mean, trying to understand first of all the facts of it, and then realizing what it meant, the reaction around the country among not just Black Americans, but all Americans to this. Police around the country condemning what had happened in Minneapolis. It was an earthquake. It was an earthquake in the middle of what was already a phenomenally unpredictable and stressful time for us. And we poured enormous resources into it. Fortunately, we have a correspondent, Fred DeSam Lazaro, who's from Minneapolis, and he was able to be there and do really important reporting for us. We sent others to Minneapolis. At this point in the pandemic, we were starting to send people out, not a lot, but we were. And it became a central focus. And it caused us to ask really hard questions about not just the questions that the public was asking about what happened and police and their attitude toward Black Americans, but about our own. Are we covering this issue the right way? Should we be approaching it from a different direction? Do we have enough people on our staff who understand what this means? And of course, all that was happening at the same time the country was in a convulsion. And so, you know, I'm not going to tell you that was an easy moment. None of what we're talking about today was easy. But I have to say, going back to a time when I've never been more grateful to be working with this solid, phenomenal team at the NewsHour of journalists, some of whom are on the air, but many of whom are producers, writers, editors, people you don't see, who just have the right temperament. And that's what got us through it. Because on any given day, you come to work and just burst into tears or throw your hands up or say, I can't handle any more grief. I can't handle any more anger and sorrow and just disbelief at what's going on.
It just
but we
dawns
had
on
to keep going.
It just dawns on me, based on a few things you've said and, just now, and also because you have an hour opposed to a half hour, you're almost forced to dwell in a way that the other news programs aren't. You have to spend more time. So what is that like? You feel like?
Well, I mean, yes, it's 60 minutes, a couple of minutes for what we call promotions and looking ahead to the next hour and so, but it is an hour. That matters a lot. But I will tell you, when there's a lot of news to pack into that 60 minutes, we feel every night we know every night there's more. I don't think ever, when I thought, gee, we need to be looking around for something to cover, because it has just been, the choices are off the charts. I mean, right now, today, last night, I'm jumping ahead in your question, Bill, but last night we were covering not only Nick Schifrin in Ukraine, we led with
Eastern Ukraine, in the middle of the hottest part of the war.
In the middle with the sirens going off in the background. So war. We had William Brangham interviewing a physician, scientist on the million, how could it be? Amna Nawaz was interviewing a nonprofit focused on the victims of the children, American children sent to boarding schools, because of the report that came out yesterday from the Interior Department about thousands of Native children who were sent away to boarding schools. The story, anything about this until just, several months ago. Now we're beginning to learn, and this is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg. There's much more to be discovered about what happened. We had another segment on the terrible statistics, but they're human. The human results of what's happened with the opioid crisis, the overdose crisis in this country.
100,000 deaths.
One thing after. I have a colleague at work who often says to me, is there ever going to be a night when we can just do news? I say, nobody would love that more than I would, but of course that's not what you do in the news business. But we are in a particularly stressful and troubling moment right now. No question about it. There's no getting around, and our straight in the face and help you understand it and understand it. And even if it means tackling some things that, in my view, are almost untackleable, the divide when it comes to facts in this country, and having a whole swath of Americans who don't believe the election was fair.
That was my next question. I'll take you through two more hard ones with students, and help understand six.
Sure.
One of the things that we're so thrilled about, Jim having joined our council, you honoring Jim and what you do every night, is it matches our commitment to civil discourse. Those of us who grew up watching, boy, David Brooks has had so many counterparts over the years, right? It was, he's had E.J. Dionne, Shields, and now he's got Capehart. But you also go out and interview people individually, whether it's members of Congress, from civic groups, nonprofit organizations, business leaders. This is something that so deeply divides the country, though 65% of Americans still more or less believe that Joe Biden won the election. There's a 30 to 35% that deeply believes that the election was fraudulent or stolen. How do we get civil about something that's become so uncivil?
By doing our job, by asking, by trying to understand every day. And I will stress all this by saying that I think all of us in the media, most of us, and including us at the NewsHour, me, didn't really understand, didn't go. There was this happiness, dissatisfaction, sense that they weren't being listened to, paid attention to, that the elites were looking down on them. That was happening out there across the country. It still is happening. I think we just didn't do our job, and I don't have a good explanation for it, but I will say we talked a lot about how we had to do a better job of getting out there, and then lo and behold, we had COVID, and it made it even harder. But we still tried, but I still think we have not done a good job of understanding what it is that's driving this deep resentment, unhappiness, anger that abides in the heart. I mean, I know what I believe, and what I think is, what I know is proven to be true, that the election was fair. All the court cases that were filed by the other side were all missed, Republican and Democratic appointed judges. We know, the leading figure, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, other cabinet members in the Trump administration all ended up saying the election was fair. But you still have this group of people led by the former president, and I will not say that, I'm not going to tell you that it's easy to figure out how to cover it, but we have to keep talking to those folks. We have to keep trying to understand what's at the source of their anger, because if we don't, we are, in my view, we're just giving up, and we cannot ever give up. We have to keep looking at this, trying to understand where they're coming from, And I don't mean to keep saying they like it's us and they. I don't mean to make it sound that way, because we're all in this together. We're all Americans. I mean, we have this phenomenal system of government, this democracy, which you celebrate here at the university and at the Miller Center, which allows us to have this great debate without going out on the street and shooting each other, which we all pray that it's not going to come to that. But how many other countries on the face of the earth can have these debates? Not very many. So we have a great blessing in our democracy. We need to do everything we can to hold on to it. And that means looking for understanding, looking for small ways. Frankly, I don't want to, but this is in our communities. We have to continue to work together, talk together, whether it's at the local level, the neighborhood level, and not give up, which is what happen if we just go our separate ways.
Last question, and then we'll start bringing the students in. We're in Ukraine, oddly, is one thing that is uniting America, 80%. By and large, though, President Biden, the assessments of President Biden are 50-50 on the war. They're higher than on almost anything else going on right now. And on the conservative side of the spectrum, more or less consensus around the Biden policies, either one thing or another. So I'm just curious about, on something where there's so much consensus, do you look over your own shoulder? Democracies have all come together around this, but if you count India and China, much of Africa, and a lot of Latin America, they're actually kind of so-so on where the US and Western policy toward Russia is. On something where there's so much consensus, how do you deal with that?
You mean the countries that are not on board?
Yeah,
Is that
exactly. So much consensus
India,
in the US,
China,
the India and
yeah.
China. And
Well, I think each one of these countries makes decisions based on their own self-interest and what is good for them and how they see where this takes them in the short run and the long run. I mean, India, it has a lot to do with their fuel needs and why they need Russia. China has its own set of strategic issues at play here that we're all, I think, familiar with. So I think that's clearly part of it. But there are other countries. I mean, as you mentioned, some of them right in the EU, like Hungary, they each. But I think, I mean, I just have to say, in talking about Ukraine, what we've seen the Ukrainian people do has been, I've run out of adjectives, has just been jaw-dropping. The fact that they've dropped everything else, they are fighting for their country. And yes, it's an existential threat that they face. The alternative is something they can't bear to think about. But this is a country that was part of the Soviet bloc not so long ago. And they've made a decision. They're going with freedom. They're going with freedom, and they're going with whatever they hope is their democracy. And I've just been awestruck by how they've come together, the sacrifices they've made, staying behind to take care of an elderly relative, to take care of a sick friend, a neighbor. I'm just overwhelmed. Yes, a lot of Ukrainians have left, but many, many more are still there, and they're fighting for their country. So that's given me a lot of heart. And maybe it's a lesson for a country everywhere. Yes, when we think about the United States, how we came together after 9/11. It didn't last more than what? It lasted almost a year. But maybe it'll take another existential threat for us to come together, but it shouldn't be something like that. It should be something more at our core. But I will say that what the Russian attack on Ukraine has done in bringing the allies together is also so striking. Adding some that Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, which is exactly the opposite of what Vladimir Putin wanted. So we are seeing, the ground shift from a geostrategic standpoint, and I think you have to marvel at that. I do think President Biden deserves some credit, and he's been given credit, even Republicans, for holding the alliance together. Sure, there's the criticism that U.S. should have done more sooner. Let's be getting them more weapons. And we're going to keep having those debates, because just last night, Nick Schifrin said on our show, on our program, that the people he's talking to say this could go on for months and even years. And if that's the case, what does the support of the United States and the rest of us look? I mean, are we prepared to hang for months and even years? And who knows, maybe that won't become a question. I mean, I will tell you, my one concern I have right now is, what if a month from now, Vladimir Putin, still in the east and maybe progress in the southeast toward Odessa, says, okay, I'm ready to stop here. I'll just claim this territory and we'll stop. What is Zelensky going to do at that point? Because he has said he's not going to give up. I mean, there are so many unknowns to me.
Well, I want to bring the students in, but I just want to thank you and your teams. You talk about your teams a lot, and they are extraordinary. The coverage of all of these has been really inspiring. And one last hat tip to you, and when Kristen and I watch the show at night, after whatever segment, you often have a wonderful line that's pulled either out of their reporting or out of something that someone said. And so the one that you just said now, months or even years after Nixon, and we look at each other and how did she win? So thanks to you, Judy. You're just, it's really great. So I am now going to turn to our students. They have come up with a plan. So Dominique Bailey, these are all fourth-year students. All but one has finished their exams, graduated.
They're going to go easy on me, right?
So these 5 students were part of a class that Miller Center Governing Council Dave Burke and I taught in January. It was a 2 where these students have others interviewed 30 superstars in Washington. We're going to do this in person in Washington, the Omicron variant. We did it by Zoom. And essentially 3 hours a day, they were on with a senior leader, a senator, members of Congress, 2 secretaries, senior officials, journalists. They're rock stars. Dominique Bailey is a 4th-year student going on to law school a couple of years at someplace in Boston that, let's just call it the UVA of the Ivy League. Dominic, you go first.
Well, thank you for joining us. As I looked into your background, one of the things that stood out most to me was that you grew up as an Army brat. I served more than 30 years. Our family and a lot of influenced us. So my question is, your background as an Army brat influenced you personally, but also perhaps your journalistic approach?
Well, thank you. Was born in Oklahoma when my father was stationed at Fort Sill nearby, and when I went to Germany for a few years, and then back to the United States. We were at military bases in Missouri, we were in New Jersey, Oklahoma, Taiwan, and then my father was stationed at Fort Gordon, Georgia, where I ended up going to high school and finishing school. So I have to say it's profoundly affected who I am, because I grew up I went to 7 schools by the time I was in 7th grade. We were moving a lot. And I learned how to, I'll just say, you have to make friends quickly, but one of the things is you also have to learn to say goodbye to friends quickly. And I swore to myself, I didn't realize this till later as I was growing up, my children to have in place. I wanted them to make friends and keep friends and not have to say goodbye after a few years. So I went straight to that because it's something that's in my heart and in my head. Having said that, seeing these differences, being with children from around and people from around the world, living in Germany from the time I was, I think until I was 8, speaking German. In Taiwan, I was speaking Chinese. Don't ask me to speak either language now, but it was a reminder that this is a big world and a big place, and that America, for as great a country as we live in, and we are so fortunate to be here, there's a lot out there that is, that we can learn from, and that we need to respect. And so I mean, one of my most vivid memories, I was little, was driving through the streets of Mannheim, Germany, and Hamburg, and I think you're from Hamburg, right? And seeing, so this would have been 5-6 years after the war ended, seeing huge piles of rubble over from the war, and asking my parents about what is all that. So those images have never ever gone away. And then in Taiwan, driving, being I guess driven in a pedicab down the street to a Girl Scout meeting, going to school across the rice paddy from where we lived. I mean, all that is still very much in my mind. But I know that it made me want to do something that was not, that would allow me to move around, to try to understand the world more. It's kind of fuzzy, but that's the impression it left.
So Mary Catherine, great to have you. Mary Catherine McCullough's 4th year, graduating from school, double major in?
Public policy and English.
In English. I knew there was another one in there. And is going to work at the Justice Department starting in August when she gets her
Trust.
And antitrust, yes, ma'am. To have you here today. Bill's line of questioning focused on recent crises. I was hoping that you could tell us about previous crisis that sticks out to you as being particularly in terms of learning how to frame
Just say the last part of the sentence again.
in terms of learning how to frame or conduct investigation.
The crisis that I come back to, which is, I think, is 9/11. I happened to be with CNN then. I was on the anchor desk from 9 or so in the morning till late in the afternoon, and I don't know, I mean, the whole country was in horror, gripped by this, but I guess the thing that I came away with is I watched the towers come down and represented, and the is just how helpless we are sometimes as journalists. We are covering what's going on, we are trying to help you understand it, but we can't make things better. We can't go in and fix it, no matter how much we want to, how much grief. All we can do is try to be there and to observe it with you, to take it in as you do, and to try to help everybody understand it. But there are some things that happen that are just bigger than all of us. Is one of them. I also happen to be I was in the press pool the day President Reagan was shot, just a few, like 20 feet. At that point, I was early in my career. I was at NBC. And, that was a very different kind of an experience where we all didn't know initially what had happened, but once we did, I think everybody felt complete in that situation. It was a reminder, again, I mean, early in my career and later, that we as journalists have to keep doing our job when we are overwhelmed by something that we're covering. Yeah.
So Miret Negusi is a pre-med student and born in Ethiopia, grew up in Southwest Virginia at a boarding school, essentially. And she has a sister who's a first-year student who already has become a Miller Center acolyte. So Miret, thank you, and fire away.
So my question is kind of related to what Bill asked about racial reckoning earlier. So the people of Minneapolis have drafted a list of demands, some of which calls the end for qualified immunity for police officers, but also asks for investment in the Georgia loan. So I wanted to kind of ask if you think their demands are futile, or if they're able to be met during the polarized time. Having conversations during this difficult time, what you think where the demands can go.
Well, from the social justice movement. I think as I tried to begin to suggest a minute ago, it's cause who is thinking about where we are in the country, this huge issue of race in our country. Think about how we've addressed it in the past. I don't see how we can approach American politics, any aspect of thinking about how for the longest time, Black Americans were not full citizens, and then after they were not given anywhere close to the equality when it came to either voting or access to jobs and on down the list. Healthcare. It is a huge piece of America's legacy. I think it makes us stronger as a country to deal with it head on, to talk about it, to these demands, issues, and to try to work through them. I'm not going to say where we ought to end up on police reform, on reparations, on so many issues, as I said, from education, healthcare, and you can go on down the list, housing, the economy, jobs, and on and on. But I think, again, to me, what makes us stronger as a society, as a country, is that we do confront our mistakes. We should be confronting them. And that's how we work our way through. That's how we stay strong as a nation, political system, because if we don't, I mean, to me, there's just no alternative. Because if we don't, we're going to go backwards. We're going to be continuing to, none of these things is easy. I mean, none of these things has easy answers. I think we are better because we are now talking about it. So it's heartbreaking to think that it George Floyd to get us to this place, but it did. That has led to all these other steps that we're now seeing. And I'm sure we're not at the end of it by any means. I mean, there's so much more that we need to address in terms of equality. And as I mentioned ago, how we treated Native Americans in the country is one that we have not fully by any means come to grips with. We've got a lot of work to do there. So I think as journalists, our role is to ask these hard questions, to demand answers from people in positions of responsibility. Make decision policy. We are here to ask, demand answers, hold people accountable. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that we can fix it overnight. We can't. I think I was just mentioning how sometimes I do feel helpless because I'm watching these horrible things happen. But the role of the journalist to be your eyes and ears, literally, and to keep pushing. That's what's going to make us stronger as a country.
Political communication on a political campaign.
Very soon. So you mentioned in an interview from 2016 that you aren't ready to give up on the idea that Americans don't give a damn about news editors. So do you still believe that? And if so, could you speak? Networks have covered international news correctly and incorrectly to keep the focus on what's happening not only in the US, but also for domestic policies as well. So
I thought I was going to get at least one easy question. I frankly does a good enough job covering. And that started decades ago. I mean, I remember when I was long ago at a different news organization, and that had been done that shown when you ask people what kind of news are you interested in, international news or foreign news they called it, was not at the top of the list. It was years down the line, and there was less coverage. And it's one thing that I absolutely pride myself on about, one of the many things I pride myself on that the NewsHour does, is that we have a commitment to covering the world. Does it mean that we can do all the stories up to, I mean, we have to make tough choices every single day. But it's on our radar screen, and thinking about it but no, it's something that's a long time ago because of those reasons. Started out as a local reporter in Atlanta. Learned within the first, I don't know, year or so that I was there, that the show doctors thought, and this was in the 1970s, that we needed to have more stories, shorter, and they needed to move. And this was the early days of, I guess television had been around then a couple of decades, but that there was already a push. If you want more people watching, you've got to keep that fast pace, you've got to keep it going. And that's where it is. I mean, it's the surveys, and everybody's done them. I'm not going to sit though and trash all news. I mean, I think, look, the networks, NBC do at any given moment do phenomenal work covering. They've certainly covering Ukraine, the least. And CNN International in particular, because it is international. I wish there were more of it shown on the domestic CNN, but they do as well. So there is good work being done, but it's another case of, we can't just do a poll and say, you really want to hear about Kim Kardashian tonight? And a lot of people know. If it's an up to. But we don't have to make room for that on the NewsHour tonight. About what do people, I don't want to make it sound like we know better than everybody else and we know what you need to know. But some of it is thinking, okay, what are people really going to benefit from knowing about? And that's kind of how those decisions come.
So finally, Sophie Rosa, who's with the Miller Center now, 2 years. She was my summer intern. And then we just kept other people. So she's worked on our Democracy and Capitalism project. She's worked on democracy initiative stuff. Sophie is from near Hamburg, Germany, and is the daughter of a Who. So 2 generations of Wahoo in the Rosa family. So Sophie, fire away.
My question goes to your art of reporting and interviewing. What is the question that you have asked? Why is it your favorite question? Or a favorite conversation that you had during your career?
Oh, Sophie, such a question. I think it's why. The problem is that in a 6-minute interview or a 7-minute interview, if you ask why too many times, you end up getting a much longer answers. And for anybody who's watching who knows anything about journalism, you have to think the time. When I'm on the set and when my colleagues are on the set doing an interview, we have a little button in our ear with the director giving us time cues. 6 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes. So I'm hearing that, and that's for most interviews. Now, if I'm lucky enough to get an interview with really phenomenally important, the president, vice president, more than 6 minutes. But for a quote unquote tip, I have to think about how much time do I have, and is this the kind of interview where I'm trying to get to, say it's a senator, and we're talking about the Roe v. news out of the Supreme Court, and say it's a Democrat, and I'm talking to them about, okay, you've lost this vote in the Senate, what other, doing anything about this issue, I'm going to be pushing them to try to, what other options are there? Because my perspective, there aren't many options that they have. I mean, once the court rules, if you're on that side of the issue, you will be working in the States. If you're on the other side of the issue, you're going to have a different set of priorities. So if I'm interviewing a Republican senator who has a different position, I'm going to be coming at it from a different perspective. So every interview is going to be framed around who that person is, where are they coming from, what's the issue or issues, and how am I trying to somebody about a book they wrote. Like yesterday, I interviewed David Gerg, used to be on the NewsHour's, has written a book about what happened. Well, it's really, the book is about leadership, but it's really basically, his thesis is that everybody 60 should get out of politics and the younger generation take over. He's saying basically that Trump should step down, Pelosi, in other words, a complete abdication of everybody. We've got, so anyway, so I was interviewing him and trying to push him on why, and so this why question, that's my favorite, because I think it helps me get to how somebody's thinking. But so I was asking him the whys. I was saying, okay, so you really want to get rid of Pelosi? Who's gonna hold the Democrats together? You want to get rid of McConnell? So then you're going to have Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley likely having a lot more influence. And what does that look like? So I was trying to get him to think about different scenarios. So I don't think I did a good job of answering your question, but time does have a lot to do with it. And if I have all the time in the world, I'll ask why, mostly.
That's right. I think we have time for one more question. I thought maybe we'd go through one more round so as not to choose anyone over another. I'm going to ask for a former colleague of yours to come up and ask a final question. Ann Compton, who was with their governing council. Ann was on the council for 6 years.
Woodruff Compton, known
Ann Woodruff
and friends of 40 years or more. You're at your desk at the NewsHour, and Jim Lehrer comes over and puts a 90-page document down in front of you and said, Judy, I'm convinced that while I don't know who the source is, I am convinced this is an authentic draft of a Supreme Court decision that would overturn Roe v. Wade. Imagine, what would Jim do? And because you are now the moral compass there, what would Judy do?
Well, what a question. What a question. Only the Ann Compton would ask a question so tough that Jim and I would do the same thing. I hope I would do what Jim would do, which is, depending on what time of day you get hold of this document, but at any time of day, is do everything you can to authenticate it. Talk to somebody who has argued cases before the court, former Supreme Court clerks. This thing that could have been written in February, that Alito would have written. Somebody who's familiar with Alito. Does this look, and talk to several people. I'm describing it, but I would be moving frantically fast to try to nail down, does this look real? And again, it would be people who are close to the court, people who've served as clerks, people who maybe they've been at justice, they've argued cases before the court. I mean, that's how I would do it. I would do all that homework before I would put it out on the air or online or in any form. I would try to vet it and make sure that it looks legit. And of course, you're calling the court, ask them formally, is this something that's real? Is this legitimate? But you're probably not going to get an answer from the court. The court didn't initially say anything, but then, as you know, within afternoon, Chief Justice Roberts did say, but it was mid-afternoon before he said, yes, this is real, it's authentic, it's a real document, and we're going to find out where it came from. But I wouldn't just go put it right on just because somebody threw it over the transom. I mean, it's the way a journalist would work. You'd have to, I gather that's what Politico did. I mean, I noticed the Wall Street Journal seemed to have it too. I don't know whether they had used Politico. But I have to, I salute Politico. I don't know how they got it, but this is a century. The court has never leaked. We haven't had a leak. There have been small leaks, nothing like this one. And they're all why, and you've seen them, and we'll know the real deal probably in a few weeks. So,
Well, speaking of real deal, thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm accepting of the entire NewsHour team, who are so extraordinary, and I'm so fortunate to get to work with them, and on behalf of the amazing Lehrer family. And once again, I want to give all.
I thank your team and our team. I also see our friends from VP and Richmond here, who we've worked so closely together with on a number of projects. We produced a documentary on the President Bush 41's foreign policy, which ran on PBS almost 2 years ago now. Wow, boy, time has flown. And thank all of you for coming and bringing the Miller Center to real life. We've also benefited your engagement in the webinars we've done. We've lived behind for 2 years as well, and this community really turned out there. Good to see everybody again. And we'll see you on webinars. I don't think we have any in-person for the rest of the year, but we have 1 or 2 things coming down, and we'll, of course, see you all back. Have a great summer. And Judy, thanks again. You just...
Thank you. Thank you.